If you could if you could each walk us through the decision-making process that led you to choose your particular academic career path, how did you choose between teaching intensive versus research intensive roles? And how did you select between a larger university over perhaps a smaller university or a liberal arts institution in general? So we'll start with you, Jude. What was your story?
Sure. So I guess the decision to go the academic route was something that I wanted to do since I was very small, like a little boy. I think like at 7, I decided I wanted to be a professor and kind of like work through that. So the general goal to go into academia was there, although through the process, there was like a time or another when I thought about going the route of a different route kind of thing. But the decision, so I had this goal of becoming a professor. So did my PhD, completed my PhD in chemical engineering here at Hopkins. And then at that point, I wanted my work to be more medically translatable, to be able to think more about impact on people, right? So I did a lot of like cell biophysics and developing assays to profile cells in the context of cancer, and then started doing some work with aging. But I wanted to see what it was like in medicine, right? So how can I use my engineering in an actual medical setting? So that's when I went the postdoc route, and I strategically picked it to be not an engineering postdoc. So I picked a medicine postdoc. So my PIs were physicians, and I don't know if that was a good hindsight. I guess it was a good call, but I only applied to MD labs. So as I started, it was a huge learning curve. I had a lot of obstacles to overcome through that part. But then in the end, I wanted to go to a research intensive place that provided the resources and also the capacity to do the kind of research I wanted to do. So I want to do research that spans both basic and translation. So be able to develop technologies, be able to understand and make new discoveries, but then put those in the context back of humans and impact, and how can we actually use it to better society, especially since I'm working on a question like aging.
And did you always know you wanted to work on aging, or did that develop all through since you joined the postdoc and after?
Right. The path towards aging started during my PhD. So I know I wanted to work with disease and health, but at that point, it wasn't structured for aging. It was like I started with cancer. So I started doing a lot of work with cancer. Then during grad school, my great-grandmother started to deteriorate in her health. So she was, I think, 96. And then that's when I started thinking a lot more about aging. And around that similar time, I had some conversations with a gerontologist in the med school about some of the challenges that he sees in the clinic every day. And then since then, I've sparked that interest in aging, but then understanding that I need to supplement my engineering because I don't have as much of a bio background. So incorporating the hematology and the immunology from my postdoc, and then now just bringing everything back together now in my faculty phase.
Very clever strategy. Thanks for sharing. And Jeremy, what about you? What's your story?
So I think my story is a little bit of a wandering path, I want to say. I'll be honest, I didn't know what a PhD was until I probably was in college. I didn't even think about becoming a professor probably until halfway through my doctoral studies. But I think when I reflect back on my journey, it really was, I think a lot of the critical pieces were there for me. So I grew up, my mother was an elementary school teacher, like in the K through 12 system. So I grew up in like this, and on my mother's side of the family, my aunt, grandmother, everyone were all teachers. And so I grew up in this environment where I was always in a classroom, either my own classroom or my mom's classroom or something like that. And then when I went to college, I went to Morehouse College, which is an HBCU in Atlanta, which is a small liberal arts college, very teaching intensive. But I just lucked up, and one of my physics teachers happened to be, actually a PhD was in electrical engineering, studied optics, and invited me into his like small research lab that he had at the college. And I got my first taste for research there. And he was actually the individual that told me I should go get a PhD. I should go get a PhD. And I never really thought about PhD or anything like that until that point. Even when I was at Michigan, so I did a dual degree program where I did applied physics at Morehouse and then mechanical engineering at Michigan. I wandered through various different application spaces. I thought I was going to do automotive and like all these other things before I ended up in this space, which I am now, which is more on the biomedical side. And even still, probably up until the point that I was going to graduate from undergrad, I thought I was going to leave and become a consultant and go take my engineering skills and go into work for a management consulting firm, which is like a really popular thing to do. I had a lot of friends and colleagues that did that. But I had this experience in undergrad at Michigan where one of my professors who was teaching a class would often bring in his research into the class as real world examples. And he was studying lower limb biomechanics, lower limb gait and prosthetics. And I just thought it was like really fascinating. And so I asked to get involved in his lab and really got that I guess the desire to do research and really understood and appreciated the research process. And that's when I decided to stay for a PhD. But again, I wasn't sure what I was going to really do while I was a PhD student. But it was after my PhD advisor asked me to TA a course with him that I really was like, oh, this is actually a lot of fun. I really enjoy teaching. And so that's what sort of turned me in the direction of, okay, maybe I should think about this professorship thing a little bit more. I then went on, she said, to get a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania. Even to that point, I probably wasn't convinced yet that I was for sure going to do academic route, but I was like probably about 75% sure. And I think when I weighed the pros and the cons, I decided that I work in robotics, and robotics is a really hot field right now, especially in industry. And so I decided that it was better to try the faculty route out and then decide later on that it wasn't for me and go into industry than to do it the other way around, go into industry, and then decide later on that I wanted to come back and become a faculty member and have to deal with all the things around like not having a publication record anymore. Maybe my lifestyle is not one that is conducive of being a grad student anymore, or going back into the, I should say, the academic route again. And so I figured I would do it that way. I think how I decided on research intensive universities, I think I've had a varied experience. So small liberal arts college, large public institution in Michigan, and then private, more Ivy League institution in Penn. And so I've seen the gamut of institutions that exist out there. Yeah. I decided that I wanted something that was, in my own experience, the best of all worlds. And so it was like not as big as a place like Michigan, not as small as something like Morehouse. The focus would be research, but I would be encouraged to teach. And I wouldn't be discouraged for investing in becoming a better teacher. And it turned out that Hopkins ended up being that place and a really good fit.
Okay. I love that you both have different perspectives. Jude, you knew from the get-go that academic route was for you. And then Jeremy, it was very validating for you to say to the students here who might be in the same position, like, I don't know, and I didn't know until later on that I wanted to do it. I think that's important to see both perspectives because both sets of students are in this call right now. And you both did postdocs. So my next question, and I get this question often from students, is, was the postdoc necessary? I know for Jude, there was a strategy involved in doing that particular postdoc and expanding sort of your portfolio a little bit. But do you recommend for folks here in this call today, what value does doing a postdoc have versus going straight from grad school and applying, which folks tend to do as well? Jude, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess when I talk to some of like the more senior faculty, like the path from straight to grad school to faculty used to be something that was more back in the days. It seemed to switch a bit more now that you go through the postdoc phase, solidify some aspects about your training and track record, and then go in. However, I think there are a few mechanisms now, particularly from the NIH, that is trying to drive that transition straight from grad school back. So I think it's called a DP5, which is like a mechanism that you could apply for that kind of gets you that fast track in. So if that's a potential of interest, that would be something to check out. But I think overall, there are benefits to going the postdoc route. And the length of postdoc changes based on field. Classically, for engineering, like a 1 or 2 year postdoc is typically what happens. But in more of the bio realm, those postdocs tend to be much longer, right? So a biologist could do like a 9-year postdoc kind of thing. But like in bioengineering, like my case, I did what's considered a long postdoc for an engineer. I did 4 years. But with that 4 years, it gave me that capacity to build into that like bio space. So I think definitely learning new expertise, new techniques as part of that. But I think one of the biggest biggest benefits of a postdoc is the network expansion. It's really a way to target your network expansion. And you have some say in terms of like how you grow, whether you want to grow laterally in terms of a different kind of skill set, or you want to just continue on along like the same skill set, but getting more people within that network. So I think that the true benefit, a lot of it comes in with the expertise that you gain and the network that you expand into.
Yeah, and I'd say Jeremy brought up another point, which was the importance of, you're saying networking, but importance of mentors and teachers to guide you in a particular direction, which I think many folks, especially I can relate to the fact that I didn't know what a PhD program was until I found myself in one. So I completely get that part. So we'll talk about the importance of networks and mentors. Now you're in your postdoc, you're doing it, you're doing like at least up to 4 years. What steps are you taking to prepare to go on the academic job market? Jeremy, what were some of the tangible things you did and how long was your postdoc to start off?
Yeah, my postdoc ended up being almost 2 years. And I think I also went into my postdoc with a strategy. And my strategy, honestly, was to play a little bit of catch up. So by the time I finished my PhD, all of my work was like either submitted for publication or about to be submitted for publication, like journal papers, and was still like under review. And so I knew that I didn't really have a chance, reminding you that I decided later on that I was probably going to try the faculty route. And by the time I defended, I had no journal papers actually published at that time, right? A bunch of conference papers in engineering, they're all peer reviewed, but no real journal papers. And so I knew I had no shot of getting a faculty job like right out the bat. And the postdoc sort of, in some sense, bought me some time to get those publications out the door and actually publish, which I was able to do. And so that was one goal. The other goal was that like all of my work in my PhD was focused on upper limb prosthetics, and I wanted a different experience because as I was thinking about a faculty career, I didn't want to just have to rest all of my like research on one particular application space that like if the funding were to dry up, what would I do? And the lab that I went in, excuse me, also engineering, very similar discipline, but a very different application. And then I started looking at like surgical robotics and robotic surgery and training and things like that. And so I was able to take the same skill sets that I developed as a graduate student and apply them in that domain. And so I think what it gave me the advantage of when I came out on the job market, in addition to what Jude mentioned in terms of networking and my postdoc advisor just being phenomenal and introducing me to everyone that she knows and everything like that, but it also gave me this opportunity to present my research as this hybrid between what I'd done in my PhD and what I did in my postdoc. I think the postdoc in engineering, I don't think it has to be too long. I agree. It's not like in the biomedical sciences where you're doing sometimes 2 postdocs. I think it can be short, but it can be very fruitful. I like the postdoc. I used to joke about this all the time, but I like in the postdoc to like academic purgatory because you're no longer a grad student anymore. You're not really a faculty member. So you don't have this like dissertation hanging over your head and advisor that you need to, and committees that you need to please, but you don't have the freedom of a full-fledged faculty member. But it is also this really interesting time where you get to just do research for the sake of doing research. And so I think it can be very like freeing academically to just say, what am I interested in? And as long as your postdoc advisor is okay with it, or you've got your own funding to pursue these things, you can go off and do it. And so it is the first opportunity that you get to almost become an independent scientist. And so I think it's like training ground essentially. And I think I am better prepared. I was better prepared as a faculty member to start my own lab because of the things and the skill sets that I learned as a postdoc, advising graduate students, advising master students, and whatnot.
And Jude, any additional perspectives to what you thought prepared you to get on the academic job market while you were a postdoc?
Yeah, I think a lot of the similar things. And then that decision to go onto the market versus stay a little bit longer is definitely something that kind of like varies, right? For instance, I know there's at one point in the end of my second year, third year kind of thing, one of my mentors told me that I was ready, but I didn't feel like I was ready to go. And then I had to think about the different perspective of that. So how would I know that I'm ready? And then what does this person see in me to say that I'm ready that I don't necessarily see in myself yet? And what ended up happening was that I just went the following cycle. And during that time, had that whole time to put things together, put in perspective, talk to my network, like essentially activate them to let them know that, look, I'm about to go up on the market. So what are some ways that they could support me, help me, connect me through conferences and stuff like that, and introducing me to different people and stuff like that. So those are, in addition to getting the research portfolio like in line, that you look like attractive on paper, also having like touch points with different people on the ground. Yeah.
You had mentioned a little bit about not knowing when you were ready. Sounded a little bit like what folks might experience in terms of imposter syndrome, imposterism, where you're probably very qualified and very ready. You just have to get over that hump to make that next step. What was the most intimidating part about getting on the job market? Because like Jeremy said, you're in an in-between sort of realm, not a graduate student, not a faculty member. What were you most intimidated by, and what advice do you have for students who might be hesitating taking that next step? Jude?
Yeah, I think so. For me, I went into my postdoc with this strategy in my mind saying, okay, like this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go outside of my comfort zone into medicine, something I know like nothing about, and learn it all, right? And I think one of the mistakes that I made in the beginning through that transition is that I like thought about it so much in a different light that I kind of left my engineering to the side and tried to assimilate and become and kind of learn that like biology piece of it. And as a result, I really struggled my first year and a half kind of thing. And I felt like I wasn't as productive as I wanted to be, because my goal was like I go in there 2 years and then publish 1 or 2 papers and then leave after that. But then by the time I got to a year and a half in, like the papers were in progress, but they weren't at the point where they're like ready. So at that point, I started like second guessing a little bit what my strategy is, what my strategy was, and trying to figure out a way to kind of like pivot. So by the time I got to kind of like my third year, about to go into my third year of postdoc, when this mentor was telling me that he thinks I'm ready, I was thinking more in the lines of, I don't think I have a strong enough portfolio to kind of make it, right? And then secondly, kind of like thinking I struggled so much like in that transition point in the early phases of postdoc. And a lot of times, like, and I was struggling and nobody else knew I was struggling, right? Because I was like, I just kept everything in, right? So maybe that's a lesson in itself to have share with your network kind of thing. But then I think when he told me I was ready and I didn't feel, I knew that there are certain things I had to change, right? So what I did is it tried to be more, my productivity, have it be more tangible, right? So instead of maybe trying to close off stories a little bit faster or trying to be more efficient, instead of pushing multiple projects, like you strategize and say, okay, let me close off these. That way they're in progress and then you can do things like that. And then also getting like other perspectives from other mentors and then seeing what they think, and then just talking to people who have made that transition. And in every case, it's different. So it's a lot of times we try to just compare ourselves with others who's done it before, but everybody's like perspective is slightly different. Everybody's like path is slightly different. So not because somebody got a faculty position with 15 papers means that you need 15 papers to make it, right? And I think with me, like I had a lot of publications, but I didn't have a lot of like first author publications because I collaborated a lot. So I came in. So that I felt was another part of my weakness of my application, that my ratio between first author to total number of publications was a bit lower. Whereas like some people would have, 10 solid publications, but you have 7 first authors, something. I think mine was more like 3 first authors, right? But then that just meant I had to be more strategic in terms of that transition point, and then having ways to have tangible aspects of productivity that they kind of look for.
Sounds like you played to your strengths. For example, you knew what the strengths were, you knew what the limitations were, and you chose to work on those strengths and your application packages and leveraging your network. What about you, Jeremy? Was your story a little bit different? What were some of the steps you took to actually prepare those application materials that get you in for an interview?
Yeah, so I think the whole reaching out to folks, I put my materials together and let my postdoc advisor see them, let my PhD advisor see them. When I went to conferences, and this wasn't necessarily me, this was my postdoc advisor, would introduce me and say, "Oh, did you know Jeremy's going to be on the market soon?" And so gave me, her vote of confidence. I think the playing to your strengths, I think, is a really important thing. I did not go into this, again, reminding you that I was maybe 75% sure I wanted to do the faculty route, even in my postdoc. And so I was like, I'm not just going to do this. I'm going to cast a wide net and apply to every place that has an open call right now. In consultation with my partner, we sat down and we said, okay, where do we think we could actually see ourselves living? Both of us have parents that are aging. And so we wanted to be near our parents if we could, or our families if we could. And so that really narrowed our search criteria down really to like the East Coast. And excuse me, by and large, the majority of the schools that I applied to were up and down the East Coast. And so then what I ended up doing is I started looking at schools where I'm in a very unique, I shouldn't say unique, I'm in a very specific research area. And there's not a whole lot of people that do haptics research. And so I then began to target schools where there was not a haptics person, where I could identify this key gap of, oh, they've got a lot of people that do robotics, they've got a lot of people that do like rehabilitation or all these things. What they don't really have is someone who understands like the human in the loop aspect of things. And so I went after schools where I felt like I could be a critical value add to that institution. I also went after schools like Hopkins, for example, where there was a professor here many years ago, Dr. Allison Nakamura, who is well known in my field, and about over a decade ago left to go back to Stanford, where she'd done all of her work and is closer to home for her. And so there was this big gap here where we had someone that sort of understood the type of research that you're doing, and now they're missing, right? Or now they're not here, and we need someone that can do this type of work. I think in terms of the imposter syndrome and what helped me get over the hump, I think talking to people. I think there are also a lot of programs out there, and I think the programming that's being put on right now here at Hopkins is phenomenal in that regard, because I think it's just the faculty search route can be so like amorphous, right? What is it? What do you have to get together? Like, when do you need to get it by? It's this multi-stage process, and someone needs to demystify it for you. And I think I would attend, when I was a postdoc at Penn, they had a similar series like this on like post careers for our PhD careers. And I participated in that and in other types of activities. So just the end goal was create a draft of your research statement, right? And it was like, I hadn't even identified any schools yet, but I'm just thinking about this draft of my research statement. And then I could begin to tailor it to the individual schools that I was applying to. And so I think that sort of lowered the amount of activation energy that it took to get out there and put myself out there. And I tried to just take it in very small chunks.
You're giving so much tangible advice right now. I'm so happy because it's coming across that you're talking about people to assess their skills, interests, values, and see where they're all aligned. Like, for instance, Jeremy, you considering like where you want to live, like that makes a huge difference too. People don't think about that so much, like designing your entire life, not just your career pathway. I appreciate you saying that, and appreciate both of you being so open and addressing topics like imposter syndrome right off the bat. Truly appreciate that. I'll take a pause right now to remind the students who are here that it's 12:30, which means you can start putting questions in the chat box for me to incorporate as well. This is your chance to ask the questions that you've been thinking about and mulling about. But if you don't know what to ask, you can always come back to the other sessions that we're having. Both Jude and Jeremy mentioned this is a part of a series. Next week, for example, is Dr. Suhas Pramila, who was a PhD student here in material science, is now at MIT, will be teaching you how to write a craft and effective CV. And then the following week from Columbia, Dr. Yvonne Wapi will be teaching about research statements. So we have a bunch of opportunities for you to leverage. Please take this opportunity and ask any questions that you might have. So I'll pause for a minute. I know I've warmed you up. Any questions from the audience at this point? I won't linger too much on that audio, but put it in the chat box if you do. Okay, so continuing on, let's just one quick logistical question. How soon into a person's postdoc or graduate studies do you recommend that they start putting their application materials together, research statement, diversity statement, CVs, so on and so forth, before they get on the job market? Like, can you describe a little bit about your cycle in engineering for those folks who are unaware? Jude?
Yeah, I think it's not, I guess I'm trying to think about what did I do. But in terms of just getting ready, these series, attending these series are super helpful. So same series that we're on now, same one Jeremy talked about. So there was one at Weill Cornell as well. That was like a combo with Rockefeller and MSK. And I attended that series, I think 3 years in a row, right? And with each year, you gain a little bit more. And it helps give you, sometimes like the first time around you hear it, then it doesn't stick. So I didn't necessarily start putting together specific documents, but then just started like jotting down ideas and just like thinking through certain problems, such that by the time you get to the point where you need to start writing it, you at least have like a scrapbook of ideas that you can run with. So I think it's definitely good to start thinking about it early if that's the kind of like the path. But then in terms of just writing it, you typically write it closer to when you're getting ready to apply, because by that time there'll be different papers may come out that may modify your idea, maybe either strengthen it or show that maybe you should go a different route in terms of the hypothesis and so forth, and those kinds of things. So thinking about it from an early point, but then having the kind of like the ideas and the different frameworks ready in mind, like what you need to prepare and so forth, is important. And also you can start writing a research statement or diversity statement and so forth, but different institutions and different programs have different requirements, even in the same department. So for instance, I only applied so my degrees are in chemical engineering, but I applied to biomedical engineering and chemical engineering programs with more biomedical engineering programs, right? And some of them, they would ask for a 2-page research statement. Others wanted a 4-page or a 6-page one, right? So the strategy that I did is that I had like a template of a 4-page one, and then I could expand or I could trim it down. So it's like setting yourself up that you don't take too long with modifying between each of these different, what is needed for each program and so forth. Yeah.
So it's important to obviously tailor it to each program, but don't linger making it perfect. You have to stop at some point.
Yeah, and it has to be big picture, right? So a lot of times we want like a perfect research statement. It doesn't have to be the perfect research statement. It has to have to bring across the excitement and like what you're bringing to this idea and this topic, like from that. And one of the things I didn't mention before, but it applies also to some of the other questions that you asked, was that there are sessions within other conferences, right? For instance, Biomedical Engineering Society and AICHE, which is the American Institute for Chemical Engineers, actually have it, which is Meet the Faculty Candidate, right? So that's another place that you could network. But then it's also a place that when you're really close to the market, right, you test out your ideas, right? So these are like the chairs and the heads of recruiting committees coming around, right? So if in some cases, some people test the market a year before, so you can test out the ideas and see like their body language, see how they perceive the questions they ask. And then in cases when you're on the actual market, you have it a little bit more structured, but that's also a good like testing ground, not only testing ground, but a place to make a good impression on your ideas.
Okay. Jeremy, I'll ask you a different question because we have questions in the chat box. Because we're talking about preparation, we'll answer Amelia's question. What can I do in the first few years of my PhD to start setting up a foundation for success in job searching on the academic job market later?
Yeah, I will try to answer it as best as possible, being someone who did not probably have the foresight in my own PhD. But I think if I reflect back on sort of what things helped me the most, I think as a faculty member, I would say having somewhat of an independent project or a project where you can clearly take the lead on as a PhD student, I think really helps you, because you get to see you're not just taking someone else's direction and just executing on it. I think things that inevitably ended up helping me, that again, I wasn't like purposefully doing this. It just so happened that it worked out this way. When I started in my lab, my PhD advisor had just come back off of his sabbatical. And so he pretty much cleared his lab out and was rebuilding it. So it was basically me and one other PhD student that were from our first year, the senior students in the lab. And so that afforded me a lot of opportunities, such as being able to and I should also mention my project was not funded at the time when I started working on it. And so I helped my advisor write research grants. And so I got a chance to see the research grant writing process a little bit, at least. My advisor also would take these month-long retreats in the summer where he would go visit his his family in Germany. And he would leave me pretty much in charge of running the lab while he was away. And so I had an opportunity to know, what is it like to organize like lab meetings and check in and make sure that people who need to buy stuff can get stuff and forms are filled out and IRB is taken care of. And so I got a chance to do that. So I think as much of that you can do as a PhD student, asking for opportunities to be a little bit more independent or take on a little bit more of the logistics and administration role of research, because the truth of it all, is that once you become a faculty member, you actually stop doing the research almost like the first day, right? And then what you become is like a research administrator and manager. And I think the more you can get at least even an experience of what that is, I think the better off you are. I also always had undergraduate students working in my lab and my research projects. And I was always managing research or aspects of the research in a sense. And that was very helpful as well for understanding, like, how do you take this big project and delegate certain tasks and keep people on track and come back together and co-author papers with multiple people. And yeah, so I think those things help.
Great ideas. Just take every opportunity you can to expand on your portfolio, build up the skills necessary, even if that is a little bit of project management skills, because that's what you're going to ultimately do. But I think communication skills also, right? Like being a good writer, like working on your writing, sitting down, working on your papers together, getting feedback. I think feedback is something that professionals don't usually seek out, but can be so important in the space. So I think that's beautiful advice. Thank you, Jeremy. Jude, there's a question from like an international perspective. How important is it to secure a fellowship for a postdoc if you're targeting a competitive school? Do you know of any resources that are available, databases, so on and so forth? Because international students might have less opportunities to apply to fellowships.
Yeah. So there are, I guess, like Hopkins has a resource of like different fellowships, but again, it's a lot of it for like non-international. It's for like local people. And so when I was on the market, when I was doing my postdoc, I was still an international student. So I was born in Grenada and I grew up in Grenada. So I was on an F1 visa through my whole like undergrad, grad school, and part of my postdoc. I think a lot of times we think of it as like it being necessary to have a fellowship, but it's not, right? There's many people who make it through and become faculty without having one of those fellowships, right? There are very few fellowships that actually international students could apply. Like the K99, I think there's no restriction on it, right? So that's like a transition sort of fellowship. But targeting like foundations a lot of times is a good approach, right? There's a lot of these foundations. For instance, I worked a lot in hematology and lymphoma, so the Leukemia Lymphoma Society and like the Lymphoma Research Foundation and like those kinds of things. So targeting these foundations sometimes provides these fellowships. And yes, it gives you a little bit of added flexibility and it looks good on your CV. But even without a fellowship like that, I think just putting together like your best package, right? So making sure you're as productive as possible, that you do the things that kind of sets you up for the next step. You can definitely go through and become a faculty without having a fellowship. I didn't have one. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I hope that was helpful, Aishwarya. Jeremy had mentioned getting an opportunity to write grants along with your PI. We have a question from the audience. How much does having a research grant facilitate the selection process when you're on the academic job market?
Yeah, I think in very rare circumstances are coming into a faculty role with a grant in hand. I think Jude talked about the K99 R00 as one that you can get as a postdoc, that comes with funding to start your faculty career. Another one is the Burroughs Wellcome Fund has one. It's called Pathway to Independence or something. I can't remember the exact name of it.
Like the Cassie, right? The Carrier Award. Kind of one.
But it functions very much like K99, right? You get the money as a postdoc, and then you take the money with you as a faculty member. Those are exceptions. That's not typically what happens. And most of the candidates that I've seen come in or interview here at Hopkins and my departments and the various search committees that I've been on do not have their own sort of grant funding coming in, especially if they're coming in at the assistant level position. Now, if you're associate professor and above, yeah, you will be bringing grants most likely with you if you're applying to an institution. But coming out of a PhD or a postdoc, it is not expected that you would have grants. The other thing that I would say, and this you have to take it with and evaluate it at each institution, is that if you are coming in with money, right, your institution may see that as a means by which they can lower sort of their contribution to your startup. Every time, when you get into a faculty position, every institution, especially research institutions, will give you a startup package that includes money to pay for grad students, to pay your own summer salary, to pay for supplies and materials and things like that. And if you're already coming in with money, and I should say that money, that pot of money that the university gives you is typically treated as a discretionary pot, which means you can spend it on just about anything. Some universities will stipulate that some of this has to be explicitly for students, the rest of it has to be for research. But a place like Hopkins, they give you a pot of money and say, use it however you see fit. If you're coming in with a grant, that grant may be tied to a specific type of research that you're planning to do, which may not be representative of all the research that you expect to do. And so you could be, let's say you had $1 million startup and you're coming in with 250,000 from a grant. That means that you've only got 750,000 now to basically spend at will on all the other research. And those numbers may seem big, but $750,000 goes quickly when you're paying for grad students and postdocs and things like that, or you're buying huge pieces of equipment. In the biomedical sciences, it's not uncommon to have huge startups because you're buying a microscope or some other piece of equipment that costs $1 million by itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and this case struck me as you were saying this was most people are going to say, oh my God, I have no idea about how to spend money, how to set up my lab. I have no idea. And perhaps both of you will say you learn along the way. No one goes into it knowing already.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. Yeah. You don't know. I don't know about you, Jude, but yeah, I knew nothing about what is indirect cost and how do you account for indirect cost and what is it? And every agency is different. Like NIH grants, for example, indirects are not built into the budget. And for those that don't know, indirects are basically the money on top of whatever you get that basically is used by the university to fund all of the operations. So not all of them, but a lot of the operations. It's a tax on doing the research that the university takes. But different agencies count it differently. NIH, if they say your budget is $500,000, that's $500,000 in direct cost. That means you get $500,000 over the life of your grant. In SF, if it says $500,000, that includes indirect costs, which means you're getting something like $360,000 over the life of the grant, right? And then foundations, which Jude and I have talked about at length, they will do things like artificially lower, I shouldn't say artificially, they will lower what they take in indirect costs. The university has a 63% indirect cost rate, and some foundations say we'll pay at most 20% in indirect cost, right? And so you have to figure all of this out. Fortunately, most universities, and this is another reason back to our original question around one of the earlier questions around how did I decide where I wanted to go? The good thing about research-intensive universities is that they have staff in place that can help you solve a lot of these problems and figure these things out. Even submitting grants is a huge endeavor with so many forms that have to go in and so many boxes that have to be checked and like all of this stuff, and trying to do that on your own is really difficult. And so if you go to a big research institution, they're likely going to have the support resources available for you to help you put these grants in.
Yeah, and also help you keep track of all the spending and so forth. So having that like financial grant support staff, as for instance, I think most of us, it's probably the same for all of us as faculty, but every quarter you meet with like a team and they go over your books and you get your numbers. This is how much you spent. This is how much you have. And then that helps you like strategy, right? Okay, I need to like work on these grants. I need to have a certain amount of money coming in by X and Y time or so forth. So it's a lot of it is like the support that you have once you're at a place that becomes very important.
Yeah. I just want the students in the audience, isn't this like fantastic information? If you agree, put a reaction or something in the chat box. I'm really excited at the level of depth we're going in with this conversation. So thank you so much. One last audience question looks like before we go into one other topic I've prepared, which is recommendation letters. Amber asks, who should ideally be our recommenders, and does it make sense to strategize who writes our recommendation letters? How does one do this? Jeremy?
Yeah, it definitely matters, right? And I will say that you want you at the end of the day, you want people that are going to write a recommendation letter that basically sounds something. First off, you want everyone that writes your recommendation letter needs to be a faculty member. That's just, I think, that's a minimum at the academic level, because if you've done internships or if you've done all these other amazing things and those individuals would write your recommendation letters, it is very hard for them to talk about your potential as a faculty member or an academic. And so I shouldn't say only academics. We as academics like to feel like only academics can talk about those things. And so we tend to rate academic faculty recommendation letters higher than anything else. So that's just, you have to know that's the case. That's the bias that we have coming in. And then I think within that, essentially, you want your recommendation letter to sound something to the effect of, Jude is the most amazing and productive graduate student that I have ever had. And if I could keep him at my university on the faculty route, I would, right? But I know it is better for his own career to get a different experience. And you would be fortunate if you said yes, right? That's the flavor of the recommendation letter you want, right? And so you need to think about, within your sphere and circle, who are the people that can actually write letters to that caliber? And not just say that, but then back it up with sort of meat to basically say, this is why I feel this way. And so naturally speaking, if you're a PhD student, your PhD advisor hopefully could be one of those individuals. If you have a postdoc, now you might have both your PhD advisor and your postdoc who can write those letters. If you've collaborated with folks during your research, those are individuals that could potentially write your letter. And then in terms of who you choose, right, I think a lot of it depends on who is available, right? If you've only got 3 people, you choose those 3 people. If you've got 5 people, right, and every university takes, let's say, 3 letters, then you start to say, okay, who would be most receptive of the letter from this person at this university, right? If they happen to be an alum at that university, right? Or they happen to have gotten their PhD from that university, right? That may be a strategy to say it might be better to get it from this person because they can talk about specifically what the university climate and campus is and how this you would contribute to that. And I think there are a lot of subtle things that go in, but by and large, if you've got, I think that first 2 boxes checked, right? And the style of the letter is such that it's like, you would be missing out if you did not say yes to this candidate. I think that sort of clears the bar already. Everything else is icing on the cake.
That answers that question, but hopefully, but that raises another sort of topic. Both of you, there's a running theme in what you've said. People, you can't do this alone. There are going to be people who support you. You had mentors, teachers, your recommenders, all of them contribute to your success. So speaking of network, both of you mentioned how important that was in activating your network. Jude, what does that mean? How do you activate your network and where do you start? Are you using social media? Are you actively doing this now in your PhD? Can you speak a little bit about what you meant by that?
Yes, by activating the network, I mean that just keeping them aware, like letting them know what it is you want to do. And then as a mentor, if you know what the mentee or that person wants to do, then you'll try your best to like open doors or resources and stuff like that. So that's what I mean by saying activate them. And the way I started is a lot of times is definitely your PhD advisor tends to be like one of your first ones, right? Like your mentor, right? But everybody has limitations, right? So I tell my students that all the time. Yes, I am your mentor, but I have limitations. There's certain things that I can't provide, right? Therefore, like having a network of mentors is how you compensate for that. How you exactly go about to put together this network of mentors, different people have different styles. I'm somebody who's very shy, more reserved end, right? So it's hard for me to just walk up to somebody and just start talking. So a lot of ways I've figured out as I go is that having like introductions in. So like my mentors who I'm cool with and they know it's a little harder for you to just walk up to somebody and so like they make those like the ice-breaking piece. But then in some cases, strategically, like if I know, I was like, okay, I need to just brace my nerves and go up and talk to this person. And I have done it. And every time I've done it, it's always been a great experience. And that person has always been like a great resource. And so it's like a combination of having your mentors introduce you in to expand your network that way, but also so like going up, like talking to people. I think the whole notion with social media recently, it's changing, right? The landscape is very different to how it was even like 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago when I was on the market, right? I'm not as active on social media, but I do see the benefits and I see how it impacts even in the short time that I've been a faculty, like how it kind of like impacts, because it helps to get your name around, right? So even if somebody may not know you personally, based on a post, you get on their radars kind of thing that way. So I think there is a big role for social media, but then I always think of it you take it with a grain of salt, in the sense of not all personalities are able to just take full advantage of it. But there are benefits to a lot of these different resources. Social media is just one aspect of it. But then having a network of mentors that you can expand with, going up, talking to people at conferences, or just like cold emailing people, a lot of times are ways that I have tried in the past.
Okay. Because we're coming on time, I want to leave you both with one question for the students who have stayed on. One single question: what critical advice would you have to offer students who are currently contemplating their next steps in academia within the engineering space? Jeremy?
I'm going to build off of Jude's thing. I think talking to people, I think that's the best thing you can do, is talk to anyone that you can, talk to faculty members, talk to other postdocs, and just say, every one of us that's a faculty member has their own story. And you can see Jude's and ours are very different, but we still ended up in the same spot. And so everybody has a different story. And I think learning about their story and why they ended up making the choices that they made, and like why they continue to make the choices that they make. Because why do you stay as a faculty member is also an important question. And not everybody stays. Some people leave. Some people go do other things. Some people go into administration, go work for the government or other things. And so I think just talking to people, many people, even within your discipline or within your field of research, but outside of your field of research, I think is super helpful. Talk to other graduate students who are contemplating the same thing. I think it'll just help you get a better picture for what it is that you're trying to do, and figure out if what you're trying to do is actually what you ultimately want to do.
Thoughtful. Thank you so much. And Jude?
Yeah, and I think just having fun with it. It's like a big part of a big decision, a big part of your life. But then a lot of times we just go at it like so stressed. But just trying to take some time to just have fun with the tutor process. And there's a lot more that you gain through the process than just like landing that position. So as you go through the different process, the different interview process, you're actually building your network that way as well, right? Because there's schools that you interview with that you make forever colleagues and collaborators and stuff like that with it, right? You're still expanding your network. So I think trying to maintain the perspective of it as you're keeping good communication and talking to people, activating your network, just taking the time to have fun and with the process and enjoy the process.
Beautiful. What a way to end the session, and what a way to start the entire series. Thank you both so much for your advice and guidance. I hope the students got a lot of value. I'm sure they did.